In 1945, as the ruins of Europe's major cities settled and the world was reeling from the horrors of Auschwitz, an important yet quiet process was unfolding. A group of Jewish intellectuals, refugees, exiles, and survivors began to confront the impact of the Holocaust not only on lives and borders, but also on ideas, culture, and the very essence of Western civilization. This video delves into how the wartime and post-war generation of Jewish thinkers turned to one of the oldest texts in European literature, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, to pose unsettling questions. What does it mean to glorify heroic violence after genocide? Can the humanism of the Enlightenment withstand the scars of the camps? What if the Western canon itself holds the origins of the disaster? Through visual works like Dali's Apotheosis of Homer, philosophical critiques like Adorno's Dialectic of Enlightenment, and the writings of notable figures such as Hannah Arendt, George Steiner, and Rachel Bespaloff, this video traces how Homer was transformed from a symbol of cultural pride into a representation of grief, division, and profound loss. You'll witness how Jewish scholars, who once saw classical traditions as pathways to assimilation and citizenship, began to question whether those same traditions had let them down, and how they reinterpreted Homer through the lens of trauma rather than triumph. This narrative goes beyond literature and history. It reflects how a civilization faces the moral failure of its principles, and what transpires when the core texts of a culture are examined in the aftermath of its most significant atrocities. In 1827, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres was tasked by French King Charles X to embellish a ceiling in the Louvre. His painting, The Apotheosis of Homer, inspired by the Hellenistic sculptor Archelos of Priene, depicts the great bard of antiquity seated before a temple named after him. The catalog entry from its first exhibition noted, "Homer receiving homage from all the great men of Greece, Rome, and modern times. The universe crowns him, Herodotus burns incense." In the painting, Homer is portrayed as a divine figure, his epics serving as the foundation and pinnacle of European artistic achievement. This is symbolized not only by the presence of his literary successors, Dante and Virgil, but also by iconic figures like Molière and Racine in drama, Mozart and Gluck in music, along with renowned painters and sculptors such as Poussin and Michelangelo. Homer stands at the peak of a pyramid surrounded by revered greats, including Sappho, embodying both the source and summit of human accomplishment. At his feet sit two women, one brandishing a sword and the other holding an oar, representing the Iliad and the Odyssey, which anchor his legacy. Over a century later, Salvador Dali presented his version of Homer's legacy. Instead of a grand temple, his work features a slab of marble with a disfigured horse's head, possibly the Trojan horse, melting into the earth. A human face emerges from the marble, perhaps one of the Greeks in hiding or on the brink of being engulfed. The focal point captures Phaethon's dramatic fall. Having taken his father Helios's chariot to guide the sun, he loses control, and Dali freezes the chaos of man, horses, and chariot at the critical moment of their plunge into the sea that threatened to obliterate the world. In contrast to Ingres's portrayal of Homer as a deity, Dali illustrates a tragic apotheosis. Phaethon, who attempted to ascend to the heavens, misjudged his own abilities. The painting captures him at his highest point, coinciding with his impending demise. In the lower right corner, shrouded in shadow, lies a female nude, resembling a corpse or a woman engulfed in sorrow. She shields her eyes, avoiding the horrors of history unfolding around her. This reimagined vision of the poet and his historical significance reflects the era of its creation, around the time of the atomic bombs detonated over Japan in 1945. The painting conveys a scenario in which an atomic bomb, Phaethon plummeting from the heavens with the sun's full force, has struck Ingres's temple scene, resulting in broken fragments, frightened animals, scattered and charred bodies, and gaunt figures, either succumbing to despair or mourning loss. But this is no nightmare. The painting's other title, Diurnal Dream of Gala, reveals the dreamer as Dali's wife, implying that this dream occurs while awake. Ingres presents European civilization in all its splendor, yet Dali proposes that the pinnacle of this Homeric existence lies within the ruined cities and lifeless bodies of World War II, including the Holocaust itself. Behind the female figure lies an open grave, accompanied by a disfigured body that appears to be melting, and in front is a broken stone inscribed with Hebrew letters. Dali asserts that the climax of Homer's legacy is Auschwitz. His interpretation of Homeric glory serves as a forewarning of the nuclear mysticism, a blend of his fervent interest in science, mathematics, and technology, with his passion for Catholicism and spirituality that would define his work post-war. Dali's reimagining of Ingres' vision utilizes Homer's image to highlight the disillusionment of wartime intellectuals with the broader goals of the Enlightenment that had inspired humanistic thought for centuries, what Hermann Brock, a Jewish-born Catholic convert, referred to as these 150 years of disintegration. This very tradition, traced by Ingres from Homer to his own time, receives a critical reinterpretation. According to Albert Boehm, the apotheosis was consistent with Ingres's love of authority and pretense to omniscience, depicting the crowned Homer looking over the expanse of culture both in time and space within Europe. This portrayal aligns with the totalitarian politics of his patron, King Charles X of France. One ruler, one perspective, imposing his dominant interpretation. Boehm argues that the work served the purpose of the royal patron, creating a cultural analogy to his vision of hierarchical social and political stability, with Homer's dominion in the cultural realm equated with that of Charles X in the political. Yet Dali's apotheosis counters both perspectives. The one gazing is an injured and mourning woman, unable to fully see. The humanistic journey that commenced with Homer concludes in Holocaust, its literal meaning of consuming destruction, and in the Holocaust, representing the genocide of the Jews during World War II. This book delves into one dimension of the diverse responses of Jews to the Holocaust. It looks at how a specific group of largely European and secular Jewish intellectuals who were well versed in the classical tradition and deeply affected by their individual and collective experiences during the war, managed to craft a counter-narrative to the dominant interpretations rooted in Homeric triumphalism. Even though many of these Jewish thinkers grew up within a framework of Homer's interpretations, they discovered that the war had fractured a once unified vision of history, one that had incorporated Jews into the secular narrative in a way that reflected their assimilation into contemporary European life, into something resembling Dali's shattered fragments. It could be said that this art was created, as the Homerist and philosopher Rachel Bespaloff remarked about her fellow Francophone Jewish émigré, Jean Wall, against the most shattered background of history. Reflecting on the war years in 1990, George Steiner, born in France to Viennese Jews who fled to America in 1940 and who often wrote about Homer and his epics until his death in 2020, observed that, with the Second World War, recognitions seemed to alter. The shattered, burnt cities are still perennial Troy. Not only did the war devastate cities and lives, but it also shattered the significant political promises the Age of Enlightenment once held for European Jews like Brock, Steiner, Bespaloff, and Wall. The prospect of citizenship in a multi-ethnic or assimilated polity, which for them represented a shift from Jewish exclusion to universal participation in the nation's life. In 1932, during a time when political violence and anti-Semitism surged in Germany, alongside Nazi successes that would soon lead to Adolf Hitler's chancellorship, Brock's friend and fellow German Jewish émigré, the political theorist Hannah Arendt, published The Enlightenment and the Jewish Question, reflecting the sentiments of many of her contemporaries. In contrast to the Zionists, who envisioned their future through self-determination in a sovereign homeland, Arendt maintained hope that Enlightenment values could affirm the position of Jews within European society. The modern Jewish question dates from the Enlightenment. It was the Enlightenment, that is, the non-Jewish world, that posed it. Its ideas and responses have shaped how Jews behave and assimilate. For Arendt, the link between Jewishness, Enlightenment, and assimilation is rooted in reason. She devotes the beginning of The Enlightenment and the Jewish Question to exploring the friendship between Gotthold Ephraim Lessing and Moses Mendelssohn, one a prominent advocate for the Enlightenment, the other a notable Jewish figure within it. Arendt asserts that for Lessing, reason is a shared trait among all humans and serves as the cornerstone of humanity. It is the fundamental connection that unites Saladin, Nathan, and the Templar. This emphasis on what is reasonable cultivates the ideal of tolerance and its promotion. In this context, reason is intertwined with humanism, as it uniquely has the potential to bridge the gaps created by differing histories, religions, and identities. Arendt points out that man holds greater significance than the truth, which is softened in favor of human worth. This worth is revealed through tolerance, and the universal application of reason reflects what is human and compassionate. Whether or not Arendt's view of assimilated Jews in Germany and Europe is accurate is less critical. What's important from an intellectual history standpoint is that, amid the rise of ethno-nationalist identity politics in Germany, a young secular German Jewish intellectual articulated a defense of reason as the Enlightenment principle that could serve as a thoughtful, philosophical, and ideological response. The concept of universal humanism under reason had the potential to improve the declining status of Jews in a society increasingly focused on their differences, highlighting the Enlightenment's promise for her and her contemporaries. However, that same year, Arendt also wrote Original Assimilation, an epilogue to the 100th anniversary of Rahel Varnhagen's death, in which she admitted that while the Lessing-Mendelssohn model represents an admirable ideal, it has ultimately failed. Today in Germany, it seems Jewish assimilation must declare its bankruptcy. The Enlightenment, she explains, offered Jews the hope of emancipation and, crucially, equipped them with the rationale to demand equal human rights. As a result, many became staunch supporters of Enlightenment ideals. By 1932, however, that promise not only remained unfulfilled, but began to manifest its opposite, Jewish exclusion laws. Over the next decade, these laws escalated to horrific extremes, leading to the Holocaust under the Third Reich and its allied governments. The failure of the Enlightenment thus created a complex crisis for European Jews, affecting their ideas, identities, historical perspective, political realities, and survival, both individual and communal. The fallout from this failure detached Jewish intellectuals such as Steiner, Brock, and Arendt from the secular society that had once grounded them. This dislocation was particularly pronounced for their German Jewish peers associated with the Frankfurt School, including Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Erich Fromm, and Herbert Marcuse, as well as others like Erich Hobsbawm, Ernst Cassirer, Erich Auerbach, Rachel Bespaloff, and John Amory. Arendt notes in Original Assimilation that due to the isolation caused by exceptional laws, every Jew was compelled to recognize their identity as Jews, regardless of their personal feelings about it. In a more personal reflection, Auschwitz survivor Amory expressed this sense of loss in his essay, How Much Home Does a Person Need?, where he stated that European Jews hadn't lost their homeland. Rather, they came to the painful realization that it had never truly belonged to them. He characterized their connection to that land and its inhabitants as an existential misunderstanding, asserting that what they considered their first love had turned out to be racial disgrace, and asking if what they believed formed their essence had ever been anything beyond mimicry. His profound alienation led him to change his name. Born Hans Keim Meyer in Vienna, he later moved to Brussels, adopting John, the French version of Hans, along with Amory, a French-sounding anagram derived from his German surname. Alan Itkin points out that for Amory and other German Jews, the seizure of Jewish property and the expulsion of Jewish individuals were justified by the notion that they never had a rightful place in the community. In a way, the Nazis aimed to erase Europe's Jewish and more broadly diverse history as an objective in itself. Jewish intellectuals became aware that the final solution was rooted in the ideation of Jewish otherness propagated by Nazi thinkers, an idea that had long been lurking beneath the surface in Christian Europe. Adorno and Horkheimer make this clear. The generality of the ideas developed by discursive logic, power in the sphere of the concept, is built on the foundation of power in reality. The realms of intellect and politics work together to uphold power, demanding responses that address both. The years leading up to the war questioned Jewish perceptions of the Enlightenment, but the war itself obliterated those beliefs. The discoveries about concentration camps, known to the world by 1942, marked a turning point, coinciding with, or perhaps prompting Enlightenment critiques in several works that began that year: Adorno and Horkheimer's Dialectic of Enlightenment, Auerbach's Mimesis, Bespolov's On the Iliad, and others. Jonathan Drucker notes that Auschwitz, that single word, calls the entire Enlightenment project into question. The reactions from that generation of Jewish thinkers varied widely. For example, Walter Benjamin and Stefan Zweig both took their own lives during the war, grappling with the intertwined personal and political devastation it represented. Simone Weil, a Francophone Jewish philosopher, starved herself in England in 1943, just 3 years after publishing her anti-war essay, The Iliad, or the Poem of Force. Shortly after the war, in a haunting reflection on the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Rachel Bespaloff turned on the gas in her kitchen near Mount Holyoke College, sealing the windows and ending her life alongside her elderly mother in the next room. Years later, 2 Auschwitz survivors, Ameri and Levy, also chose to take their lives. Hermann Broch passed away from a heart attack in 1951, having expressed in his diary that, "I am slowly, implacably killing myself. I have exhausted myself working, and I find myself consumed by the very conflicts that have defined my existence. On one side are individuals like Auerbach and the Austrian Jew Leo Spitzer, both of whom lost their academic roles due to the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, which barred Jews from positions in government, education, and beyond. Jeffrey Hartman, a German Jewish child refugee turned literary scholar, refers to them as part of this trinity of restorative scholars. These and other like-minded thinkers, as noted by Avihu Zakkai, aim to salvage the European humanist tradition by reconstructing its literary history. One way they did this was by turning to Homer, whose epic works Adorno deemed the basic text of European civilization. In the spectrum between restorative humanists like Auerbach and Levy, and those such as Bespaloff and Adorno, who sought alternatives to humanist ideals after the war, we find a myriad of Jewish writers. A particularly striking example is the Italian Jewish historian Arnaldo Momigliano. While he seldom wrote about Homer, his case represents a group of Jewish classicists, historians, philologists, and philosophers whose extensive writings frequently show only indirect, if any, connections between the ancient and modern worlds, or between Homer and the Holocaust. Before the war, Momigliano, much like Arendt, held assimilationist views common among many secular educated Jews, dismissing Zionism and stating in a brief review from 1933 that Italian Jews had integrated into the new Italian state during the Risorgimento, similarly to various regional identities like those of Piedmont or Sicily, merging into a singular national identity. During the interwar years, Momigliano became a professor of ancient history in Turin in 1936. However, like many of his Jewish contemporaries throughout Europe, he lost that position due to racial exclusion laws enacted in 1938, despite having pledged allegiance to the fascist government, a requirement for all state employees. His situation is further complicated by ongoing discussions about the extent to which he embraced fascist ideals or simply took the oath as a means of survival. Though he managed to escape to the United Kingdom, his parents tragically did not. They perished in Auschwitz in December 1943. The bond he shared with them was so profound, and the trauma of the Holocaust so enduring that years later he engraved their deaths on his own tombstone. It reads, "Here lies Arnaldo Dante Momigliano. His faith embodied free thought, devoid of dogma and hatred, but he cherished the Jewish traditions of his fathers. Here he wishes to be united in memory with his parents, Riccardo and Ilda Momigliano, who were killed in German territory in November 1943 due to irrational racial hatred." Despite Momigliano's personal ties to the Holocaust, Moshe Idel suggests that modern Judaism was not the focus of Momigliano's discussions. Neither the Holocaust nor the founding of the State of Israel prompted detailed examination. Idel contends that he felt no obligation to address these subjects, given that his primary academic interests lay far from them. However, this notion applies broadly to many humanists exploring the distant past. Yet a number of Momigliano's contemporaries infused their interpretations of ancient events with insights shaped by the war, while others sought to connect contemporary understanding to Homer and earlier histories to grasp the ideologies influencing the present. Momigliano stands as a part of this group. His personal connection to the Holocaust is undeniable, yet his scholarly work seldom draws a direct line between his experiences and his extensive writings on ancient Judaism and Christianity. According to Edel, the deaths of his parents during the Holocaust and his trips to Israel were not, presumably, subjects he felt the need to analyze. Dino Piovan suggests there is at least an implicit link between ancient and modern, noting in relation to Momigliano's pre-war scholarship that, by emphasizing the peaceful coexistence of different peoples, one cannot ignore the moral and intellectual concerns that are easily connected to the emergence of Nazism, which seized power in Germany in 1933. No matter how subtly he might reference contemporary political issues or how they may have influenced his research interests, the relationship between ancient and modern remains, at best, tangential or implicit. This inclination towards indirect references is perhaps most clearly displayed in a lecture that Momigliano gave in 1958 called "Some Observations on Causes of War in Ancient Historiography." In this lecture, Momigliano suggests that the worst type of literature comprises those works that incited wars and were themselves causes of conflict. He cites only two examples, starting with the Iliad, which he argues set the precedent for all the Achilleses and Agamemnons that have caused turmoil throughout history. Momigliano hints at the lasting influence of Homer, subtly leaving out any direct mention of the war that had recently ended, the one that had claimed the lives of both of his parents. When he remarks that war remains a tragic necessity, a fate that the gods have dealt to unfortunate humans, he traces this back to Homer. He positions Homer and the Iliad as the origins of a culture steeped in violence and death that persists to his time. War still remains a sad necessity. This unspoken reference lingers in Momigliano's work. Similarly, the shadow of the Holocaust permeates Jewish interpretations of Homer during and after the war, influencing George Steiner's writings, who extensively explored both subjects without explicitly linking them. His work personally addresses the issues posed by Arendt in a more theoretical framework in his discussions on enlightenment and assimilation. His autobiography, Errata, An Examined Life, opens with the image of rain falling on his childhood home in the Tyrol Mountains. The summer was already ominous. In those mid-1930s, Jew hatred and a desire for reunification filled the Austrian air, he notes, adding that his father sensed a looming catastrophe. He recalls how Hitler's speeches, when broadcast, punctuated my childhood. My father would lean closer to the radio, straining to listen. Steiner recounts his father's struggle against anti-Semitic Vienna, the birthplace of Nazism, in dire terms. With foreboding clarity, my father foresaw the coming disaster. A systematic, ideologically driven hatred of Jews simmered beneath the surface of Viennese culture's glittering facade. The world of Freud, Malher, and Wittgenstein coexisted with Mayer Luger, Hitler's role model. Steiner identifies three key German Jewish intellectuals and points out that the same tradition of German humanism that nurtured them also gave rise to the genocidal anti-Semitism of the Nazis. He reflects on pre-war Jewish society, noting that the horrors that diminish this liberal spirit and vision have warped our memory. The proud Judaism of his father, akin to that of Einstein or Freud, embodied a form of messianic agnosticism, steeped in rationality and the Enlightenment's promise of tolerance. Steiner highlights the potential of secular European, especially German culture, as a pathway to personal fulfillment. For his parents, humanism, rationalism, and enlightenment symbolized a paradoxical hope for political freedom from rising anti-Semitism, even as it unfolded around them. Steiner describes his childhood as focused on a secular Talmud of Western classics, referring to it as the investment of hope against hope. A central piece of this was the Iliad, which his father had kept just out of his reach until shortly before his 6th birthday, when they explored it together in translation. They read a passage about Lycaon, the Trojan prince who pleaded for mercy from Achilles but was ultimately slain. They started with the German version, and his father then began teaching him Greek. He took my finger, placing it on the right Greek words. My father repeated the Greek several times, guiding me to mimic the sounds. With a dictionary and grammar open, the words, like a vivid mosaic uncovered by water, began to take shape and meaning for me. Word by word, verse by verse. I vividly recall the surge of wonder from a child's perspective. In this evocative moment, he and his father delving into Homer illustrates a secular religious experience at the core of the Western European Enlightenment, showcasing its promise for secularizing and assimilating Jews. The act of reading itself is filled with spiritual significance, as Steiner's memory of his father guiding his hand echoes the Jewish tradition of reading the Torah, where a pointer is used to avoid touching the sacred text directly. This moment of reading Homer is so pivotal in Steiner's view of himself that he reflects in his autobiography that perhaps everything else in his life has been a footnote to that one experience. The Iliad and the Odyssey have been his lifelong companions. Yet, while he immerses himself in Homer, the political context is never fully absent. This is highlighted by the passage his father chooses to read, where Achilles ruthlessly kills an unarmed Trojan pleading for mercy. His father suggests they memorize the lines so that the serene inhumanity of Achilles' message, its soft terror, would never leave us. Steiner describes the conflict between his admiration for European literature and the anti-Semitic animosity from its contemporary inheritors as an unbearable paradox. This Judaism of secular hope sought solace in German philosophy, literature, scholarship, and music, expecting those to provide protection. Instead, many Jewish intellectuals viewed them as contributors to the very ideologies that led to their downfall. J. Perini notes that this dilemma would dominate Steiner's intellectual journey, asking, how could the Nazi killers spend their days murdering innocent people while their evenings were filled with Rilke and Schubert? There is an element of hopelessness in Steiner's, and even Tolstoy's, perspective on art, which inevitably leads to despair. Despite the significance of reading Homer with his father as the Holocaust loomed over them, these two major themes in his work remain distinct. Edith Wishograd suggests that even without a direct link between Homer and the Holocaust, there is still a response. In her piece, The Mind of a Critical Moralist, Steiner as Jew, she generally argues that Jewish thinkers are constantly engaged with the Holocaust. When their focus shifts elsewhere, they still carry that contemplation in a sense of not thinking about it. This notion is echoed in Albert Baumgarten's reflections on Momigliano's later life, turning to ancient and modern Judaism. Baumgarten specifically points to Momigliano's published remarks, including his assertion in an article from 1984 where he states, I am a Jew myself, and I know from my own experience what price Jews have had to pay to be Jews. I am not collecting facts for academic purpose when I try to understand what moved Jews to refuse to assimilation to surrounding civilizations. He also referenced a speech from 1977 in which he said, I must, however, admit that events have made my research literally a question of life and death, which I had not anticipated when I began to work on these problems about 1925. According to him, the legacy of the ancient world influenced his scholarship, though this connection isn't apparent in his work. In an obituary written by Peter Brown, a scholar in late antiquity, a year after Momigliano passed away in 1987, he notes that Momigliano had come to England with plans for an ambitious study called Liberty and Peace in the Ancient World. This project offered him continuity amidst significant upheaval, yet the book was never completed. During his early years in England, he lost the sense of a seamless link between the past and present, between ancient history and historiography. The complexities of the situation required a respect for essential differences. Brown suggests another reason why Momigliano kept history's past and present distinct. As a historian striving for a comprehensive view in a fragmented world, he felt that no universal historical principles were applicable. Instead of seeing Momigliano's reluctance to engage in comparative analysis as a mere oversight, Brown proposes that it might have been a subject he contemplated deeply but deliberately chose not to address publicly. He believes Momigliano's dedication to ancient history was intertwined with a broader, albeit unspoken, post-war political context. Discussing Momigliano's move to University College London, Brown remarks, From a truly cosmopolitan city, he would contribute to Europe's return to sanity after the paroxysm of Nazi and fascist rule. This does not imply that scholars like Momigliano ignored these connections outright. Pierre Vidal-Naquet, the French Jewish classicist and a passionate admirer of Momigliano until their split in 1983, emerged in his later years as a prominent voice in France against Holocaust denial and antisemitism. Like Steiner, his initial encounter with Homer came during the war. In 1940, his father was assigned to oversee logistics for an artillery unit in the Ardennes, while Pierre and his family were in Begmail, Brittany. He recalls how his mother arranged for them to have a tutor, Mademoiselle Bronac. Though his mother found her lacking, Pierre and his siblings held a different opinion, which they kept to themselves. He has only one memory of her. During history lessons, she prepared him for the 6th grade curriculum covering the Orient and Greece. It was through her that he rediscovered the gods of Homer and became captivated by those of ancient Egypt, much like all children might. As the war progressed, the issue of Holocaust denial became intensely personal for him. Coming from an assimilated and well-educated Jewish family, both his parents were deported and perished at Auschwitz in 1944, when he was just 13. This harrowing experience, as Riccardo Di Donato noted, created a deep bond between Vidal-Naquet and Momigliano. In a letter from 1966, he shared with Momigliano, "You know perhaps that my parents were, like yours, disappeared in Auschwitz." He refers to that time in his autobiography as the fracture and the weight. Yet, as he dedicated his later years to fighting Holocaust denial, he chose not to rely on classical frameworks or his historical authority. In his 1980 essay, A Paper Eichmann, The Anatomy of a Lie, he recounts a moment when Paul Thibault, the editor of Esprit, invited him to address various French Holocaust deniers. He hesitated, a pause arising from several factors. Although he found their arguments unconvincing, they highlighted reasons such as perceived bias, lack of academic credibility, and personal inclination that might lead a scholar profoundly affected by trauma to refrain from directly engaging with the topic. Later in the essay, after confronting the false historical claims of Holocaust deniers who linked Jewish greed to long-standing issues since the Roman Empire, Vidal-Naquet poses a thought-provoking question. Is a historian of antiquity obliged to specify that all of this, in its entirety, is grotesque? Although he didn't specifically address Homer and the Holocaust, Vidal-Naquet deeply engaged with Greek and Jewish academic matters, most notably in his refutation of Holocaust denial and his opposition to French colonialism during the Algerian War. The Holocaust didn't directly shape his views on classical studies. Rather, A Paper Eichmann illustrates that he was aware of the potential connections between the two, but chose to keep them separate. In the provisional epilogue of his autobiography, he reflects on this inner conflict. Greece was and remains my field of research. Greek philosophy, Greek poetics and literature, Greek political institutions, the Greece of tragedy that I was beginning to discover in 1943, Greece of the historians. But if the Dreyfus affair played for me the role of an origin story, is it because it concerned a Jew? To speak frankly, in 1955, I had every reason in the world to be conscious of my Jewish condition. He then questions whether it's possible to connect the activist and the historian of Greece. This dilemma was likely shared by all Jewish classicists during and after the war, and scholars like Momigliano, Vidal-Naquet, and their friend M.I. Finley would have had differing perspectives than thinkers like Adorno, Arendt, or Brach. Yet, despite being stripped of their identity and place in history, many Jewish Homerists and Hellenophiles, Auerbach's assistant expressing a wish-fulfillment passion for everything Greek, and Arendt's niece recalling her aunt quoting Greek texts as if in a continuous internal dialogue, sought to grapple with the war's origins and envision a path forward by re-examining the world they cherished and the tradition in which they had invested their hopes for political liberation. Adriana Cavarera points out that for Arendt, Homer and the ancient Greeks represent a rich source for the Western imagination, providing a foundation for re-examining the human condition politically after the devastating impact of Auschwitz. The unique experiences of European Jewish intellectuals during the war, witnessing a relentless conflict that stripped them of their homes, subjected them to mass deaths and various trials, and forced them into disguise, shaped this narrative. For many, a fortunate return meant coming back as impoverished refugees to find their former homes occupied by strangers and their belongings taken, leaving them filled with skepticism about their relationships with those they had once considered neighbors. Given Homer's significance as the pinnacle of European humanism, it's understandable that many sought solace in the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey in different yet interconnected ways. Steiner titled his autobiography Errata, an examined life, likely reflecting not just his own life mistakes, but also embodying the wandering spirit of the term's Latin roots. Ernst Cassirer, another German Jewish intellectual who fled the Nazis, addressed similar issues in his posthumously published 1946 work, The Myth of the State, where he and his contemporaries engaged with the profound challenges they faced, often turning to Homeric epics as a key lens through which to explore their harrowing experiences. These works emerged from Jewish scholars, some of whom fled or lived in exile, a context that is often neglected when separating ideas from their creation circumstances and the author's backgrounds. For example, while Adorno and Horkheimer's dialectic of enlightenment starts with Odysseus, it concludes with a discussion on anti-Semitism. Ignoring the latter when considering the author's perspectives on the former can lead to misinterpretation at best and Holocaust denial at worst. What brought together the philosophical and linguistic studies of these scholars focused on the Homeric epics were questions of agency and identity. They sought to understand who they had been, their role in Jewish, European, and global literary and cultural history, who they were now, their potential, and, perhaps most crucially, who they might become after the war. They aimed to avoid another Holocaust. In his 1966 work, After Auschwitz, Adorno claimed that a new categorical imperative has been imposed by Hitler upon unfree mankind to arrange their thoughts and actions so that Auschwitz will not repeat itself, so that nothing similar will happen. They also wanted to explore how narratives of the past shaped the present, creating the groundwork for both the Holocaust and the challenges of rebuilding the post-war world on the pre-war foundation. When Adorno wrote Negative Dialectics 2 decades after the Holocaust, his focus was on the future, striving to avert such a tragedy from happening again. Yet, in Dialectic of Enlightenment, begun about 25 years prior amid the turmoil of World War II, and as the early signs of the Holocaust began to unfold, Adorno did not look ahead. Instead, he looked back to uncover the source of the ideology that had led to such widespread violence, and he identified it in Homer. Commenting on Dialectic of Enlightenment, James Porter remarked that the inclusion of an analysis of the Odyssey is nothing short of remarkable. He questioned the relevance of reading Homer at a time when civilization itself seemed to be crumbling, and concluded that the answer is everything. This exploration of everything forms, in part, the essence of this book. Adorno and Horkheimer's section titled Excursusware, Odysseus or Myth and Enlightenment, and its link to anti-Semitism, is the focus of the second chapter. They weave their analysis of the Enlightenment with a contemporary issue that they saw as deeply philosophical, personal, and political, intricately connected to their vision of humanism. They sought, in their own words, to realize the idea which has been unrealized until now, that the Jew is a human being. To realize this idea, it was necessary to free thought from power and eliminate violence. What they discovered was a complete rethinking of the pre-war ideology that celebrated violence and heroic battles. Instead, they proposed a contrasting approach that centered on grief, trauma, and suffering. In their interpretation, Homer narrated the genocide of the Trojans by the Greeks, highlighting the deep scars, both physical and existential, carried by the survivors. Political philosopher Hannah Arendt also explored the Homeric roots of Nazi ideology, examining ancient Greek thought and poetry to uncover what she termed thoughtlessness. She used Adolf Eichmann as a central figure to illustrate how ordinary people could suppress their natural moral repulsion to horrific acts. This theme is further explored with Jewish writers Rachel Bespaloff and Hermann Broch, who provided narratives from Nazi-occupied Europe to the United States, focusing on perspectives that resonated with their own experiences. The the non-combatant victims, refugees, survivors, and others affected by a war they did not instigate or could not resolve. The discussion continues with Jewish refugee scholars like Erich Auerbach and child refugee Jeffrey Hartman, who became Auerbach's student. Similar to Adorno and Arendt, Auerbach examined the character of Odysseus and, like Bespaloff and Brock, analyzed the Homeric epics through the lens of those fractured by war. Auerbach's wartime work, Mimesis, the representation of reality in Western literature, depicts Odysseus not as Adorno's proto-fascist, but as a wounded refugee yearning to return home, reflecting Auerbach's own circumstances while he wrote. By portraying reality through the lens of suffering, Auerbach's work serves as a critical exploration of a vital genre in post-war Jewish cultural production, Holocaust memoir. The challenge of how to realistically represent such unprecedented historical trauma profoundly affected writers like Primo Levi, who recognized parallels between his own experiences in Auschwitz and Odysseus Ulysses in Dante's Underworld. Auerbach's idea of a narratology rooted in woundedness resonates with Levi's effort to convey his experiences in Auschwitz in his memoir, If This Is a Man. The connection between memory, narrative, and wounds, which Hartman later referred to as the memory scar of the Holocaust, is a central theme. Previous discussions explored Homer and the Jews before the war, focused on various writers during the war, and turned to the impact of these writers on Jewish classicists who wrote after the war. George Steiner, Helene Cixous, and Daniel Mendelssohn each inherit a tradition of interpreting the Homeric epics through the lens of the Holocaust experiences examined earlier. Although Steiner and Cixous were children during the war, and Mendelssohn was born afterward, their insights into Homer highlight the enduring nature of anti-triumphalist readings that emphasize pain, woundedness, and grief among Jewish writers. Thus, the wartime reflections of thinkers like Adorno and Auerbach were not merely fleeting thoughts on Homer's reception. They demonstrate how the Holocaust has fundamentally reshaped the understanding of these epics for post-war readers, challenging nearly 3 millennia of prior interpretation. Hannah Arendt recognized this profound shift when she wrote in 1958 that history predates the written word, and even Homer, saying its poetic origins begin when Ulysses listens to the tale of his own deeds and suffering, transforming his life into an object for public recognition. This idea is significant for 2 reasons. It emphasizes that Arendt identifies Homer as the starting point of history, and it asserts that this history begins not with Greek triumph, but with Odysseus' suffering. All these authors, despite their unique experiences, shared this perspective, as they were all, in various ways, victims of the Nazis. In his 1965 autobiographical essay, George Steiner reflects on the condition of European Jewry, stating that the humanism of the European Jew lies in literal ash. He notes that in the voices of survivors like Hannah Arendt, Ernst Bloch, T.W. Adorno, Erich Kahler, and Levi Strauss, we detect a shared tone of desolation. Yet, amidst this despair, there existed a fierce resolve to rebuild. Whether establishing new foundations or, as many Jewish Homerists did, seeking fresh interpretations within the Iliad and the Odyssey to support a post-war humanism, this determination persisted. In her 1942 work on the Iliad, Bespaloff echoed this sentiment. Nietzsche is mistaken when he claims that Homer celebrates apotheoses. What he truly honors is not the victory of force, but the resilience of humanity in adversity, the beauty of fallen warriors, and the enduring glory of the sacrificed hero, the poetic voice that rises above fatality, even in defeat. Around the same period, as Salvador Dali painted his apotheosis, German Jewish philosophers Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer found refuge from the Third Reich in Los Angeles and began crafting a critique of Western humanism, later known as Dialectic of Enlightenment. In this work, Adorno aimed to produce a historico-philosophical interpretation of Homer, which would take the form of excursus werf, Odysseus, or myth and enlightenment. Here, Adorno articulates that the venerable cosmos of the Homeric world, a world brimming with meaning, reveals itself as a triumph of classifying reason. This assertion serves as a critique. If Ingres's apotheosis illustrates the Enlightenment systems of classification and reasoning, then they have ultimately failed. As Dana Villa points out, Auschwitz, as the emblem of the totalitarian collective, validated Adorno's concerns regarding reason's alignment with power, illustrating that even in the fundamentally irrational act of extermination, the process was executed with chilling rationality. Dialectic of Enlightenment is a key work that explores the decline and shortcomings of the Enlightenment and the humanistic values it once stood for. At its core, rationality was seen as a tool that allowed Enlightenment thinkers to understand and manage the world. This idea is echoed in the precise geometry of Ingra's Greek temple dedicated to Homer. In contrast, Dali's art reflects a world where straight lines dissolve into chaotic spirals and jagged stones, merging reality with the surreal, capturing a post-war existence that can't be fully comprehended through reason. Dali's painting embodies Adorno and Horkheimer's assertion that an entirely enlightened world radiates with a triumphant calamity. For Dali, the elevation of Homer and the classical traditions he symbolized culminated in an unprecedented destruction throughout history. Perhaps the bleakest manifestation of this destruction is found in the Nazi concentration camps, representing humanity's own triumphant calamity. Adorno's in-depth reflection on the Odyssey in Dialectic of Enlightenment serves as a literary expression of the visual depiction of Homer's elevation illustrated by Dali. As Adorno and Horkheimer emphasize in their introduction, enlightenment is totalitarian, a statement that carries even more weight when juxtaposed with Steiner's comment that the Jews are a people whom totalitarian barbarism must choose for its hatred. Prior to World War II, Horkheimer and Adorno were leading intellectual figures in Germany, Horkheimer as the director of the Institute for Social Research, and Adorno as one of its key researchers. Both lost their positions due to Nazi laws excluding Jews and spent the war years in Los Angeles, where they compiled a series of essays they titled Philosophical Fragments, ultimately shaping it into what Jürgen Habermas referred to as their blackest, most nihilistic book, aimed at conceptualizing the self-destructive nature of enlightenment. The finished work, Dialectic of Enlightenment, sought to unravel the historical roots of the social, political, and cultural systems that facilitated the rise of the Third Reich. Dialectic of Enlightenment presents two interconnected arguments, one looking back and the other forward. For Adorno and Horkheimer, the Holocaust was an unavoidable outcome of the capitalist and bourgeois ideologies rooted in an Enlightenment culture stemming from classical Greek traditions. They assert that the original myth holds within it the deception that ultimately triumphs in the false narrative of fascism, which in turn blames Enlightenment for its failings. Therefore, any attempt to rebuild post-war society on Enlightenment ideals is bound to repeat its most horrific events. While Dialectic of Enlightenment wraps up with thoughts on contemporary anti-Semitism, it opens by defining Enlightenment, followed by a historical exploration titled Excursus I, Odysseus or Myth and Enlightenment. Adorno suggests that Odysseus represents the foundational figure of enlightenment, proposing that Odysseus can only become enlightened through rational thought, which reveals that mythological entities do not exist. Hence, enlightenment needs myth, but only as a means to cultivate the mindset to reject it. Odysseus, who is physically weaker than the ancient, monstrous forces he encounters on his journey home, must devise an alternative survival strategy. He survives through cunning, outsmarting the natural deities that threaten his life. Although these elemental beings aim to destroy him, Odysseus employs reason to redirect their desires towards other things or tricks them into pursuing alternate gratifications. As the prototype of the bourgeois or the archetypal capitalist, Odysseus skillfully offers substitutes of equal worth in exchange for his survival. This transformation illustrates how sacrifice becomes capitalist. Instead of facing death, Odysseus negotiates by tricking or appeasing the gods into accepting a different offering than what they initially sought. Through his actions, Odysseus manages to survive. But perhaps even more crucial for Adorno is the shift in how rational, Enlightenment, capitalist individuals relate to the natural world. He states, "All sacrificial acts, deliberately planned by humans, deceive the God for whom they are performed. By imposing on him the primacy of human purposes, they dissolve away his power." This illustrates the dialectic of enlightenment. Odysseus relies on the elemental forces linked to myth to develop the bourgeois cunning that sets him apart. Adorno, as noted by Dana Villa, highlights the forces behind the modern erosion of the moral, political, and religious aspects traditionally tied to reason in the West. These changes raise concerns as enlightened reason becomes entwined with the ideologies of blind domination that contributed to the Holocaust. Odysseus symbolizes the prototype of the bourgeois individual, whose concept originates in the unwavering self-assertion of which the protagonist driven to wander the earth is the primeval model. As a lone voyager armed with cunning, he embodies Homo economicus, the archetype of a rational individual that society will eventually reflect. Odysseus is bourgeois, owning land and employing others. This professionalism fosters a mindset of steadfast self-assertion. He lacks a broader sense of social responsibility, prioritizing his own individual desires without regard for the repercussions on those around him or society at large. If, as Adorno's biographer Stefan Müller-Düm claims, myth is the prototype of enlightenment, it's logical that Adorno views Odysseus as the original Enlightenment thinker, and representing a mindset that paved the way for both the Nazis and the complacent Europeans who found it easier to chase personal interests than to advocate for the Jews and others suffering under Nazi oppression. According to Müller-Düm, Odysseus presents a rationality in the service of absolute self-preservation. If self-preservation reigns as the highest good, then all other moral concerns become secondary, creating a pathway to escalating atrocities, even genocide, justified in the name of individual, or in the case of the Nazis, national survival. Adorno elaborates on the lack of morality in the bourgeois drive for self-preservation through his examination of the Odyssey. He illustrates that its main character isn't portrayed as the conventional epic hero, but rather as a representation of the regular middle-class individual. For example, Adorno points out that Odysseus is weaker than the primal forces he faces during his journey home, yet he demonstrates greater strength against those he encounters in Ithaca. He references moments like Odysseus's struggle with the beggar Eris and his ability to string the great bow, showing how these actions are more playful than heroic. This allows Odysseus to embody Adorno's idea of the bourgeois archetype, displaying athletic skills of a gentleman who is free from everyday worries and can cultivate noble self-control. Consequently, Odysseus inflicts on those who remain at home a symbolic representation of what established landowners have already done to them in reality, thus validating himself as a noble figure. Odysseus becomes an amateur athlete and, in a sense, a bourgeois exploiter, exerting power over the working class, often through violence. A similar theme is found in Adorno's interpretation of the scene with the lotus eaters. When Odysseus's men consume the lotus, Adorno argues it has no actual harmful impact. The resulting state merely frees them from labor and struggle in this fertile land. For these men who are compelled to work, this is acceptable. However, for the capitalist Odysseus, it's unacceptable. He cannot allow such a peaceful existence, akin to the euphoria derived from narcotics that enables the subordinate classes to endure harsh social conditions among his own followers. Adorno essentially frames the men as a representation of Marx's proletariat, with Odysseus as their employer, who views their enjoyment as a threat to his ability to profit from their labor. He even quotes Odysseus's own statements about using force to bring his men back to the ships, where, despite their tears, he confines them under the benches in chains. Odysseus' use of violence enforces their labor, tying them to hard work, while the profits benefit him, the bourgeois Odysseus. This dynamic is also reflected in Adorno's interpretation of the recognition moment between Penelope and Odysseus. Penelope recognizes Odysseus's identity through a single secret between them. He has crafted a bed using a tree that's still rooted in the ground. Adorno observes that Penelope provides a detailed account of his lasting amateur craftsmanship, noting that as a typical bourgeois individual, he's clever enough to engage in a hobby. One of Odysseus's remarkable feats in the Odyssey is thus reframed in simple terms as merely a hobby. Being part of the bourgeois class allows Odysseus to pursue frivolous tasks, highlighting his dominance over those who engage in labor merely to survive. This woodworking activity signifies that it's not his profession, which sets him apart as someone distanced from manual work. Nancy Love points out that Adorno and Horkheimer's retelling of Odysseus's return omits not just his loyal, mistreated dog Argos and Eurycleia, his nurse slave, but also his triumphant songs. By altering Homer's story, they strip Odysseus of his role as the heroic narrator of his own exploits. Rather than being an epic champion with superhuman feats, Odysseus is depicted as a relatable figure of the early 20th century, a business owner, a hobbyist, trapped in a loveless but socially approved marriage. Adorno argues that this overly rational, capitalist mentality fosters conditions where atrocities can happen and be rationalized. He expresses that when humans detach from their awareness of themselves as part of nature, all the pursuits that sustain their existence, social advancement, enhancement of material and intellectual capabilities, and even consciousness, lose their significance. According to Habermas's reading of the excursus, reason ultimately undermines the very humanity it once enabled, a profound idea reinforced in the first excursus. Excursus Odysseus or Myth and Enlightenment serves as a retrospective examination of Enlightenment's failures, indicating that the elevation of means to an end, which in late capitalism seems blatantly deranged, can be traced back to the dawn of subjective thought. Perhaps the most troubling aspects are the middle-class ideas of home and homeland. The former represents the ultimate domain of the middle-class individual, while the latter embodies their national aspirations, an aspiration deeply entrenched in Nazi ideology. Adorno argues that these ideas of home and homeland bring along the concept of property rights, with any actions deemed acceptable if they serve to protect individual property rights and the collective notion of the national homeland. He illustrates this with a story about a king's son punishing disloyal maidservants who have resorted to prostitution. Adorno notes that the way this scene is recounted showcases an unsettling detachment, reminiscent of the coldness found in the works of the greatest narrative writers of the 19th century. The precision in the depiction reveals a chilling, almost surgical detachment. At the core of Adorno's critique lies a couple of falsehoods exchanged between Homer and his audience to rationalize this otherwise indefensible cruelty. First, the belief that there's no moral violation in protecting property as long as the end goal is to safeguard those rights. And second, the belief that the means aren't brutal. This mindset makes room for the justification of horrific acts. Adorno points out that Homer reassures him and his audience, who are essentially readers, by emphasizing that the punishment didn't last long, merely a moment before it was over. Yet this is a deliberate evasion of reality. By concentrating on the fleeting nature of the punishment, Adorno argues that Homer reveals the lie beneath his own calm demeanor and exposes the torturous suffering that extends beyond that brief second when the maids struggled against death. This critical examination of middle-class culture in Dialectic of Enlightenment is contextualized in Adorno's wartime reflections found in Minima Moralia, Reflections on a Damaged Life, which he began in 1944. The immediate trigger for this work was the celebration of Max Horkheimer's 50th birthday on February 14, 1945. In the introduction, Adorno emphasizes how the wartime atmosphere influenced the book's creation. Much of it was written during the war, under circumstances that prompted deep reflection. Immediately after, he expresses that he struggles to fully grasp the cultural shifts in Europe, especially in the German-speaking regions, because the violence that expelled me thereby denied me full knowledge of it. Yet, through the philosophical reflections brought on by the war, he arrives at a key idea that threads together the otherwise varied thoughts in the Minima Moralia. I did not yet admit to myself the complicity that enfolds those who, in face of unspeakable collective events, speak of individual matters at all. Adorno suggests that the seemingly neutral focus on oneself is, in fact, an unethical stance that may allow one, perhaps unknowingly, to share in the blame for horrific acts. Like many scholars from wartime and post-war periods, Minima Moralia serves as a response to the Enlightenment philosophy of Hegel, who, according to Adorno, hypostasized both bourgeois society and its fundamental category, the individual. Amid its wandering structure and complex language, the aphorisms of Minima Moralia unite in examining how bourgeois societies evolved into totalitarian ones. Specifically, They explore how such societies fostered an environment in which individuals could ethically excuse their indifference to public disasters by focusing on their own private matters. Reflecting on the emergence of the fascist regimes of the first half of the 20th century, Adorno states, with the strengthening of external authority, the stuffy private order, particularism of interests, the long outdated form of the family, the right of property and its reflection in character have also reconsolidated themselves. Adorno argues that totalitarianism enabled people to retreat into their private lives, but there was a moral toll. They could do so, but with a bad conscience, a scarcely concealed awareness of untruth. Whatever was once good and decent in bourgeois values, independence, perseverance, forethought, circumspection, has been completely corrupted. This retreat from the public sphere represents a form of political denial. For Adorno, the bourgeoisie under totalitarianism becomes defined by its members' understanding of a self with its own identity, goals, desires, and agency, thus neglecting a wider moral obligation. In this sense, the bourgeois have become impenitently malign. In Minima Moralia, Adorno provides a straightforward yet impactful critique of what he identifies as the essence of bourgeois ideology: competition. He notes that this principle is deeply entrenched, where each person, focused on their own interests, believes themselves superior to others. This drive for self-interest, a recurring theme in Adorno's work, undermines any sense of obligation to others, setting the stage for moral failure, including genocide. In the introduction, he asserts that during a period of societal decline, an individual's self-awareness and experiences can lead to renewed understanding, previously clouded by their view of themselves as the central figure. In the face of totalitarianism, which seeks to eliminate diversity as a goal in and of itself, even the collective force for liberation may momentarily retreat into individualism. Minima Moralia explores the individual's plight under totalitarian rule in an abstract manner, while the discussion on the Odyssey and dialectic of enlightenment examines the roots of modern ideology by focusing on Odysseus as the quintessential bourgeois individual. The complicated relationship between myth and reason goes beyond philosophical inquiry. It's closely linked to Adorno and Horkheimer's themes, specifically the shortcomings of the Enlightenment and the transformation of long-standing European anti-Semitism into genocide against the Jewish people. The concluding section of Dialectic of Enlightenment, titled Elements of Anti-Semitism, Limits of Enlightenment, confronts this very issue. In the opening of his discussion on the Odyssey, Adorno links his analysis of sacrifice within the text to his contemporary context. Today's sacrifice theory ties to a collective identity, suggesting that the blood spilled by a sacrificed individual must flow back into the community. Although totemism represented an ideology of its time, it reflects a genuine condition where dominant rationality demanded human sacrifice. This represents an ancient state of scarcity, blurring the lines between human sacrifice and cannibalism. At times, a growing collective may sustain itself only through consuming human flesh. In certain ethnic and social groups, there may have even been a link between pleasure and cannibalism, a connection that's now largely evidenced by aversion to human flesh. Adorno and Horkheimer, in Elements of Anti-Semitism, relate this idea of sacrifice to Nazi ideology. The Jews are sacrificed by the dominant power, which, in becoming more estranged from nature, regresses to primal instincts. The Jews are accused of engaging in forbidden practices and violent rituals. Masked as an accusation, the hidden longing of the indigenous Odysseus, representative of bourgeois society, must suppress these primal urges to nurture the rational mind necessary for survival against fundamental threats. He achieves this through sacrifices. The Nazis replicate this dynamic on a national scale. While Odysseus manages to control his instincts and reach his goals through logic, those natural desires persist. They are simply confined. Similarly, with the Nazis, the suppressed subliminal craving is redirected toward the Jews, and this rational capacity serves to legitimize that base desire. The Jews, then, are charged with performing the very sacrifices that the Nazis have chosen to repress, leading to the rational conclusion, from their perspective, that extermination is justified. Reason, the hallmark of the Enlightenment, transforms into the very irrationality it aimed to overcome. As Adorno and Horkheimer pointed out in Concept of Enlightenment, the myths of the 20th century and the irrationality of faith turn into organized rationality in the hands of the so-called enlightened, steering society toward barbarism. James Porter thoroughly examines how Adorno positions Homer and the Homeric epics as crucial to understanding the intertwining of myth, nationalism, sacrifice, and the unavoidable descent of reason into cruelty under totalitarian regimes. He also highlights Adorno's insight that the methods used to interpret ancient texts in modern cultures serve as the cultural frameworks that enable real atrocities. For Adorno, this primarily refers to the philological methods applied to classical texts, which often obscure violent and fascist interpretations. He makes his critique of the fascist inclination in German philology very clear. Adorno particularly critiques the esteemed German classicist Wilhelmowitz, who passed away in 1931. In a footnote discussing the scene with the dangling maids, Adorno notes that Wilhelmowitz claims the execution was carried out with satisfaction by the poet. However, when the authoritarian scholar expresses enthusiasm for the simile of the snares, representing the dangling corpses of the maids in a fitting and modern manner, it seems that the satisfaction is primarily his own. Wilhelmowitz's writings stand out as notable examples of the German blend of barbarism and culture, which is central to modern Philhellenism. Porter contends that to truly understand the distortions of modern historical awareness and the political and cultural ideologies behind it, Adorno needs to critique the philology of his own time, which he sees as the culpable companion of Enlightenment thought. Adorno views Odysseus as the epitome of Western Enlightenment, described by Pierre-François Noppen as the prototypical subject. Odysseus recognizes how his passions affect him, but does so as a means to mold himself into someone less controlled by those passions. In essence, by renouncing his drives and impulses, he transforms into a being not dominated by them, defined instead by the pursuit of his own objectives, in this case, returning to Ithaca and enjoying life as a master. In this interpretation, Odysseus becomes a symbol of bourgeois society. He is seen as the first human to apply rational thought to suppress his passions, making him the first capable of committing genocide. The contemporary figure that most closely resembles Adorno's critique of Odysseus is Adolf Eichmann, one of the principal architects of the Nazi final solution. One significant shift in the interpretation of Homer in Dialectic of Enlightenment is the transformation of Odysseus from an epic hero of remarkable achievement to an ordinary member of the bourgeois class, whose quest for personal gain blurs his vision of, or perhaps incentivizes him to ignore, his role in horrific acts. However, it was not Adorno, but rather Hannah Arendt, who became the most notable commentator on this theory. Arendt was born in Germany in 1906 and faced significant challenges as the Third Reich rose to power. She experienced a brief imprisonment and managed a difficult escape from a French refugee camp to America in 1940. These pivotal moments led to her first major work, The Origins of Totalitarianism, published in 1951, and prompted The New Yorker, a decade later, to send her to Jerusalem to cover Eichmann's trial for crimes against Jews and humanity. In 1963, she compiled and expanded her reporting into Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. Throughout the book, Arendt reveals that Eichmann viewed himself as a minor bureaucrat aiming to climb the ranks within the Third Reich's economic and political system. She frequently revisits what she describes as the blood for wares negotiations, where Eichmann attempted to exchange Jewish lives for military supplies toward the war's end. Arendt argues that Eichmann, in a manner similar to Adorno's interpretation of the maid's hanging, saw his actions as merely part of his job, potentially beneficial for his career. If morality entered the picture at all, it was overshadowed by his ambition for professional success. Through her analysis, Arendt illustrates that Eichmann perceived his behavior in strictly personal terms, devoid of any communal awareness. He was focused on career opportunities and promotions, failing to recognize any moral implications. For instance, Eichmann often stated in court that he couldn't recall many details, and despite his candid admissions to mass killings, Arendt contends that his forgetfulness wasn't a strategic ploy to evade responsibility. Instead, she highlights that, Eichmann remembered the critical moments of his own career quite well, yet these moments didn't align with the critical moments in the story of Jewish extermination, or indeed with key historical events. This serves as a contemporary illustration of the bourgeois mentality Adorno noted in Odysseus, a man preoccupied with his own advancement, overlooking the wider political and moral consequences of his actions, along with their effects on others. For Arendt, Eichmann's limited perspective and moral blindness were the key insights of her study. That Eichmann consistently worked to realize the final solution was beyond dispute. The real question was whether this indicated his fanaticism or unrestrained hatred of Jews. No other explanations occurred to the judges. For those observing the widely televised trials, emotion shaped their understanding of Eichmann's actions and the actions of Nazis more generally. Yet, Arendt proposes a different perspective where emotions play no role. The painful truth is that it wasn't his fanaticism, but rather his very conscience that drove Eichmann to maintain his rigid stance during the war's final year. Eichmann thought he was being rational. The broader moral implications of his reasoning mattered little to him. Arendt spends considerable time discussing Eichmann's view of legality, the infamous phrase, "just following orders," because it allowed him to act entirely logically while being profoundly immoral without facing internal conflict. She highlights this distinction when referencing Arthur Greiser, the Nazi governor responsible for much of the Holocaust in Poland. Greiser claimed during his trial that only his official soul committed the crimes for which he was executed in 1946, while his private soul opposed them. Arendt's views in Eichmann in Jerusalem sparked intense debate, and in a postscript to the book, she addresses several criticisms aimed at her coverage of the trial. A significant point of contention was her choice of subtitle, which she admits could have caused genuine controversy. She elaborates on its meaning, explaining, "When I reference the banality of evil, I do so strictly on a factual level, indicating that Eichmann did not see himself as a villain, contrasting his mundane evil with the more self-serving and motivated evil embodied by Iago in Othello." Indeed, reflecting on Adorno's critique of Odysseus, it's noted that aside from a strong focus on his personal gains, he had no genuine motives. Arendt asserts that Eichmann wasn't unintelligent. Rather, his thoughtlessness, a trait distinct from stupidity, made him one of the most notorious criminals of his time. For Arendt, it was this absence of conventional villainy that rendered Eichmann and the trial itself so perplexing. You cannot extract any diabolical or demonic depth from Eichmann. However, this very quality also highlighted its significance. This detachment from reality and thoughtlessness can cause more destruction than all the evil instincts that might dwell in humanity. That was truly the lesson learned in Jerusalem. Arendt observed in Eichmann a specific type of genocidal criminality that didn't arise from typical definitions of evil, yet was capable of leading to genocide. In her postscript, she addresses critics who wanted broader discussions, stating that her book focused on a sadly narrow subject. The trial report could only cover what was presented during the trial, which meant she couldn't tackle other potentially significant issues. Thus, it isn't a historical account, a political study, nor is it, above all, a theoretical exploration of evil. Yet, these theoretical examinations would come to define her later work. In her final, unfinished piece, The Life of the Mind, she revisits the strange interdependence of thoughtlessness and evil. In its introduction, she explains that her interest in mental activities was sparked by her experience at the Eichmann trial. She reiterates her argument from Eichmann in Jerusalem. Eichmann's evil wasn't something demonic, and unlike other malicious figures who acted out of envy or similar vices, the actions were horrific, but the individual was entirely ordinary, commonplace, and not demonic or monstrous. There was no indication of firm ideological convictions or specific evil motives within him. It was not an issue of stupidity, but rather thoughtlessness. This concept, as Arendt expresses it, carries a distinct meaning, with Stefan Kompowski outlining 3 definitions from her perspective: the inability to see things from another's viewpoint, the inability to understand one's own actions, and we might add a third, the inability to grasp what is happening to oneself. Arendt's work, The Life of the Mind, explores the connection between thought and thoughtlessness, helping us to understand the link between these concepts and the nature of evil. She insists that this exploration is not merely abstract. She does not aspire to be labeled a philosopher. Instead, her investigation is directly tied to the political implications of preventing the Holocaust, as demonstrated by figures like Eichmann. She poses the critical question: could the act of thinking, the practice of examining events and ideas without concern for outcomes or specific details, be a factor that enables people to refrain from committing evil or even act as a preventative measure against it? To address this vital contemporary issue, Arendt draws from the breadth of Western philosophy, particularly focusing on Immanuel Kant, who emphasized the role of rational thought during the Enlightenment in his critique of pure reason and critique of practical reason. She argues that thought cannot exist without language, yet acknowledges that language falls short of fully expressing the nuances of thought. However, examining how language has developed reveals that, according to Kant, using analogies and metaphorical expressions is the sole way for speculative reason, or what we call thinking, to become apparent. She further explains that metaphor acts as a bridge connecting our inner mental processes with the external world. And while it is the richest contribution language offers to thinking and philosophy, its roots lie more in poetry than in philosophy. Because Arendt traces metaphor back to poetry and acknowledges that Homer and his epics represent the pinnacle of Western culture, it is understandable that she views Homer as the original creator of this poetic device. Within what she refers to as an embarras de richesse of metaphorical expressions in Homer, she starts with a moment from the Iliad, where the poet compares the overwhelming wave of fear and grief crashing into the hearts of men to the turbulent winds striking the sea from various directions. Arendt's exploration of Homer's origins reflects her belief that pre-war humanist interpretations of these epic tales can be linked to the rise of fascism. Similarly, post-war reinterpretations of Homer may offer insights for a renewed humanistic identity, free from the burdens of how these works have been traditionally received. She employs the concept of Homeric grief to rethink humanistic identity. Her later examination of what she describes as another, more complex kind of extended metaphor or simile, which navigates the visible yet points to a deeper narrative, remains centered on the literary depiction of these emotional states. For instance, she refers to Penelope's tears in lines 203 to 209 of Book 19, when a still-disguised Odysseus tells her he has seen her husband on Crete. Her body was melted, as the snow melts along the high places of the mountains when the west wind has piled it there, but the south wind melts it, and as it melts, the rivers run full. Just like that, her lovely cheeks streamed with tears as Penelope wept for her man. The purpose behind this example was to illustrate how metaphor can reveal unseen realities by drawing parallels to recognizable external experiences. Sorrow is likened to snowmelt. The tears alone signify sorrow. Their true meaning, the thoughts behind them, becomes clear through the metaphor of snow melting and softening the earth before spring. However, the specific choice of this passage highlights the broader backdrop against which Life of the Mind was developed, emphasizing Arendt's desire to comprehend the Holocaust's events, the mindset of its perpetrators, and how Homer captured these elements of reality through the medium of language. While she frames her discussion on literature's power to convey emotion, the metaphors she selects delve into experiences particular to the Jewish community during and after World War II. Grief and suffering amid violence, and the sorrow over loved ones lost or missing. Just as Adorno interpreted Odysseus's return home, these examples reshape our understanding of Odysseus, portraying him not as a hero, but rather as a villain, someone who brings grief, suffering, and death to Ithaca instead of liberation. The Homeric epics are filled with similes, many of which celebrate conquest and violence. Arendt's choice to highlight certain examples reflects a pivotal shift in how we interpret the Homeric texts in the aftermath of war. In her work, The Life of the Mind, Arendt states that while all thoughts stem from experiences, those experiences only gain significance and coherence through the processes of imagination and contemplation. In this light, She seeks to reveal how the legacy of Homer influences the thinking of individuals in post-Enlightenment Western Europe, helping them find meaning in their suffering, a task made all the more urgent by the enormity of pain she witnessed in the Jewish community during World War II, alongside the troubling indifference of the perpetrators she closely examined. For Arendt, these processes are fraught with instability, suggesting that Enlightenment ideals have ultimately faltered. She echoes Kant, the leading philosopher of reason during the Enlightenment, who recognized the limitations of reason in his posthumous notes. Moreover, Arendt asserts that the pursuit of meaning is often absent and ineffectual in daily human interactions. Its outcomes are uncertain and unprovable, and thinking can even be self-destructive. Her reinterpretation of the Odyssey in light of the Holocaust highlights the precariousness of reason, which struggles to deliver knowledge through straightforward narratives. Instead, she advocates for the primacy of experience and metaphor as means to express emotion, particularly grief and suffering. Homer, she argues, legitimizes this reading approach. Indeed, she believes that the act of thinking resembles Penelope's web, unraveling each morning what it painstakingly wove the night before.